What's going on, family? It's your brother Lawrence here with another episode of Required Reading. Now, we have four readings, and I actually want to kick off one which is not necessarily from the past week, but it's something that informs a number of articles that many of you are reading in the past week. Um, I know for a number of people, you've been reading and hearing about, whether on social media or in the news, in the newspapers, about SARS, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad in Nigeria, and what's been happening with the protesters, many of them young people, and how things have actually escalated, specifically today, where CCTV was cut out. There was a curfew put into place, and there have been reports of the police using excessive force and firing upon protesters. It was important for me to, one, get context and hear from a voice from somebody who actually is from there. There's a lot of news taken from a very different perspectives, Western perspectives, I think, which often I think frames the protesters as these aggressors. And so I think it takes I think it's very important to be clear about the voices you're listening to. And so this article is actually by Amnesty International. It was written by a sister, Osai Ojigo, and she's a director for Amnesty International Nigeria. And this came in June, and at that time, she was giving kind of the story of SARS, and ultimately them being just kind of essentially operating under impunity. That there had been reports, there had been calls for requests, forms, plans through Amnesty International, in addition to those people, brothers and sisters, my brothers and sisters on the ground there, and there had been not much movement and a lot of lip service. And so all of this has been a crescendo. This is not coming out of nowhere. This has been a crescendo for some time. Now, naturally, it's very sensitive for me, I think, understanding the climate that we're living in here in the United States. And so there was a wrestle for me of recognizing that many people are not well educated about the diaspora, well educated about Nigeria, well educated about home, but also recognizing how critical this is to put national attention so that there's pressure. Because I do not want to be insensitive to the fact of what's happening here on the ground, and I don't think those two compete. But sadly, often there have been voices over the past, after many years, that have somehow seen those things as zero sum. So that's why there was a little bit of sensitivity for me around how best to bring this forth. Now, I strongly recommend reading the article because I think it gives you a foundation on why this is what you're actually seeing, and what this is boiling over from. Where you have individuals who have essentially abused the power of this role. But I think begs a larger question, that so many similarities, so many calls for reform, so many instances of abuses and impunity for a system of what's supposed to be protecting and serving has actually morphed into something. It says something about evil. It says something about systematic evil. It says something that it knows no bounds. But it says something about the system itself, and maybe our thinking of policing and what happens, again, when you have imperfect institutions, and I'm using it euphemistically, whether you talk about healthcare, business, there's corruption at every level in every country. But often, those who have the closest contact with the civilians and the people that they're looking to serve often deal with, I think, the most fatal blunts or the most fatal failures of these systems. And so I would offer you that as you read this article, and then as you then have it inform how you look at other articles and information that you're getting. And so, again, that's the first article from Amnesty International. The second article is actually from the New York Times, and I want to shout out this amazing sister who essentially brought to light. This was in the New York Times, and this was in the New York Times newsletter. I'm subscribed to New York Times, and I was literally like pulling and looking through all my newspapers, just like, did I miss this thing? But it was a young sister named Rocky, Rachel Pilgrim. Rocky's her IG and what you call it. I was trying to figure out where she was. Rachel Pilgrim was a sister based in Mount Vernon, and it was part of a historic, just powerful, amazing family of God in church up there called Grace Baptist Church. And there had been, in their announcements, they talk about the founding of this church. And they would mention 5 women, but they were unnamed. And so as she was kind of trying to figure out her thesis, kind of as she kind of nears the tail end of her schooling as a kind of an early journalist, nascent in her career, she started to ask the question like, who are these women? And what I love about this is not obviously I think there's clear spoilers that she comes up with the names with the sisters, which I will say shortly, but it kind of points to often the erasure of women in general, but black women in particular. I think around just the great feats beyond civil rights, any major movement, they're often seen as the shadows to the stories. And so I just celebrate and honor this great, great, great story. I think it's in the October 17th New York Times called The Long, Worthwhile Search for the Five Black Women of Grace Baptist Church. I think it is just a tremendous, article. And I think at the end, again, we're just kind of beginning because there's a lot more information to uncover. So I don't want to give too much away. But I would like to honor the five women: Emily Waller, Matilda Brooks, Helen Claiborne, Sahar Bennett, and Elizabeth Benson. I just thank you so much, Rachel Pilgrim, for highlighting their stories, giving them names. I'm like, well, I can't be coughing these days. So sorry, it's my water. So giving them names and starting to tell their stories because they certainly, just like Jesus Christ, are the cornerstone of that story, and so many women are the cornerstone of so many stories that are forgotten. So I'm grateful to get to read this and ultimately see what this is leading to. So that's the first article. The second article from the New York Times is by Jennifer Miller. It says, "Guess who's being asked to lead diversity efforts?" Y'all, in short, this is talking about how, especially in lieu of a more recent Black Lives Matter movement, the murders of unarmed and innocent civilians, black civilians, there have been increased movement and action, quote unquote, by corporate entities, companies of all shapes and sizes. And so this has kind of picked up an uptick of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the board. But what this is pointing out is that often, as many people, as I know, whether my classmates from B school or many of you, in general, typically, many of us are working in environments where we're the only or a handful of black employees, especially as you get more senior. And what they've kind of pointed out is how, in many cases, you'd find that these companies would essentially kind of pass the buck of the diversity, inclusion, equity, and inclusion efforts to the sole or handful of black employees, many of them not even qualified or trained and skilled in these areas, and just the burden that caused. But on top of that, it's been something that's quite pervasive. And so you get perspectives from a number of diversity, equity, inclusion companies who often are contacted by these individuals, by these employees, and how often, what kind of message that sends. Because I think for many black employees and for many black people who see these companies, a lot of times it just seems like this is just a nuisance and they want to get this off of their back and get back to what they really want to do. But often this usually is highlighting something that is baked into the very culture of their organizations. And it's an uncomfortable truth that very rarely does anyone embrace willfully. But often the sweat equity, and that work and labor that is necessary to start to undo and unneed a lot of those things that are in the surface are passed off and put on the backs of their black employees. And so I really love and appreciate the article by Jennifer Miller. I think there's a lot more in there to kind of unpack, because I have very, very, kind of specific thoughts about it because I've seen it kind of firsthand. But I think it's worthy for everyone to read because I think in many times that kind of silent labor and trauma of black employees having to carry that and have to be the voice of, with all good intentions, I think this gives a perspective for everyone to understand the impact that has and the message it sends. Now we are coming to the last two articles. Now, these two articles I think are very, very, what's the best word to say? I would say it's this last article rather was in The Economist or the 1834 magazine, and the title is "First Class Fights, Chauffeurs, and Bribery: The Secret Life of a Private Tutor." Y'all, when I tell you this was a read. Now, anything that talks about education, I love education and reading about it. And I also have to give a great shout to, I always shout out Nicole Hannah Jones in the 1619 Project, but she also has done some great, learned and amazing pieces are touching on education in general. So, but this kind of gives a picture into kind of the tutoring business. And not so much just general tutoring, but tutoring business in Britain amongst the elite. Now, the best way to describe this is something that I've said before, but they describe it well, is that often for elite parents, those of wealth, the level of, it's become almost like this education arms race. And I think it says so much more about our society because on one hand, you see, see why there's no surprise that so many of these kids are highly anxious. They are at these top secondary schools, which already people they're paying upwards of a college tuition, but then they're racking on 10 to 15 hours on top of that of private tutors, right? So even though they're getting a world-class education, just to get a leg up, right? But then again, it's hard for you to be mad when this is the type of system of education that we have created globally, right? And this article kind of talks about not only just kind of these specific anecdotes and moments of just how neurotic I think many of these families are around these tutors, and specifically how they kind of, I've seen these tutors as beyond just giving content, but ultimately trying to shape their children into people that they believe are most successful in the world. Now, on the surface, again, it doesn't seem like this is harmful. But I think as you read into the stories and as you see the lives of these students, it's almost as though it's not their lives. And it is ultimately also an indictment on the system that we've created, because I said as it is, when now, I think the best way I put it was that I think when I love track and field and I love sports, and there's like performance enhancing drugs, right? And no one would argue that performance enhancing drugs gives people an unfair advantage. Now, in the system that we have, I think there's people who have a view of war to say winner takes all. I mean, if you're competitive, you have the resources, then you would make sure that you do your best for your child. But think about what that just says, because now from schools, you've essentially created a system where those who get the best education, which is quite clear, have the most resources. Everything else being equal, which is not. And we've created this so we can't actually blame or look down upon these families who try to win at the game that we've created. And one of the things that I think that's really stuck out, and one of the things that many things that stuck out, was that how the universities are actually one of the great equalizers potentially. Not to say that they're not elite universities who have feeders through these secondary schools and they have legacy and all that, but it's to say that this is why those cases about affirmative action, why elite universities, many of them who kind of really force curve, so to speak, a diverse populace of people and try their best to represent the world and capacity and excellence from people from all backgrounds, trying to, as best as you can, calibrate for people's experiences, resources. It's because leading up to then, your wealth, your financial resources allows you to essentially distinguish yourself. And it really leaves people behind who do not have all of those resources. And the one opportunity to reset that, at least, and give people a badge to kind of continue to move forward in this broken but established system, is at the university level. And so, yeah, I kind of came in reading about, just kind of being intrigued about just this life and what this looked like. But I think I left thinking more and more how important universities are to kind of really kind of holding the line on it really doing its best to kind of go and represent the world as best as possible, pushing against the myth of meritocracy. When you're looking at two kids, how do you really judge aptitude if both kids have the same intellectual capacity, but one kid had a parent that could pay an equivalent of $200,000 additional for a live-in tutor? Does that really show that the other child is maybe more worthy or smarter if the both of them are excellent in terms of their outcome by and large? These are questions I think is interesting to wrestle with, but I find myself completely off and thinking about the implications. And I think it's worth reading. I think for someone as someone looking to be a potential parent, I mean, some of the pressures you put on, the sadness of the system that we live in, and what parent wouldn't want to give their child the best education possible? And if you have the resources, you want to give them the best. But I think there's sometimes unintended consequences of what we're feeding, for better or for worse. So obviously, it's a full slate with the Amnesty International story to read, just to give you some background as you're reading the stories of what's happened up to even today on many of those protesters being fired on, to the New York Times article with our sister Rachel Pilgrim. Thank you so much for her work in exploring and finding the names so that their stories and contributions would not be lost. The diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and for our sister Jennifer Miller and the work that she did to kind of highlight how companies, many times intentionally, often unintentionally, kind of put the load on those who are not necessarily qualified or should be called to do this labor. And then lastly, I think Emma Irving from the 1834 magazine of The Economist, giving us a sneak behind the curtain of this kind of life of elite private tutors and what it says about our society and where we're going or where we've already gone. So I hope you enjoy it. Again, as always, love to hear your thoughts, and definitely always send along the required readings you think that all should read. Take care, y'all.